All right. You could say I am somewhat an expert on moths, although I do study all sorts of different types of insects as well. All right, so in this talk today, I'm going to be talking a lot about pollination. So I want to just get some definitions down first. So what exactly is pollination? Well, really simply, pollination is how plants have sex and make new plants, or in the case of plants, little seeds that turn into new plants. And for plants, it's a little bit hard for them to do this because they are literally rooted in the ground. So they can't really just get up and walk around and meet their neighbors and that sort of stuff. So they have to rely on a little bit of help. And one of the ways they do this is through a process that we call biotic pollination. And this is simply using the help of other organisms in order to transfer the male sex cells to the female sex cells. So we have bees and all sorts of other organisms that I'm going to talk about today that transfer that pollen from flower to flower and produce seeds that grow into new plants. And this is a mutualistic interaction, and that means that both the plants and the pollinators benefit from this. The plant is gaining enhanced reproduction, and the pollinators are getting that pollen and, sorry, let me just cancel that out so you don't see it. Getting that pollen and nectar from the flowers that also aids in their survival and reproduction. Now, why should we as humans care about pollinators? Well, one of the reasons is because about 90% of all flowering plant species worldwide rely on animal pollination to one extent or another to reproduce. And so that essentially means that pollinators sustain our natural ecosystems and everything that lives in those ecosystems. But more directly, pollinators increase yield in 75% of our major food crops, and that amounts to producing about 1 out of every 3 bites of food that we eat. So this is perhaps what a farmer's market may look like with and without pollinators. We would lose many of our favorite fruits and vegetables. Now, when you hear the word pollinator, my guess is that this is probably the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people, or maybe this. But if I had to guess, I don't think that moths are probably one of the first things that most people think about when they think about pollinators. And moths have been neglected compared to daytime pollinators. Compared to daytime pollinators, and particularly bees. So we hear a lot about saving the bees, but you don't really hear a lot about saving the moths. And that's why I'm today. And one of the reasons why we don't hear a lot about saving the moths is because moths have been vilified. And that's in part because there are a few species that eat our clothes and destroy our crops and invade our pantries. But during this talk today, I hope to convince you that moths are not just these pests that we commonly think of, but instead are important components of our local ecosystems as pollinators of many plants, as well as food sources for birds and bats and many different types of organisms. All right, so I'm going to start really simply here. What is a moth? And this sounds like a simple question, but it's actually not as straightforward as you may think. So moths belong to the insect order Lepidoptera, and this includes not just moths, but also butterflies and skippers. And this word Lepidoptera comes from the Greek lepidos, meaning scale, and pteron, meaning wing. And that's literally because when we look at the wings of butterflies and moths and skippers and zoom on in, we can see that they are made of tiny little scales, almost like feathers on birds. And zooming even closer, we can see what those scales look like. This is probably under some sort of fancy microscope, I'm not sure. And moths come in all kinds of shapes and sizes and colors, and they're not just nocturnal. Many moths actually fly during the day, and you may be more familiar with the ones that we see out during the day. They can be as big or bigger than your hand. They can be smaller than the tip of a pencil. Some moths are mimics that mimic wasps, like this one. There are moths that are often mistaken for hummingbirds. They come in all sorts of really beautiful, bright colors. Some have really cool patterns like eye spots, and some don't even quite look like moths at all. Now, a common question when it comes to butterflies, moths, how do you tell them apart? Well, really the only surefire way to do this is to look at their antenna. So butterfly antennae are always going to be clubbed. That means basically it's like a ball on a stick. So when you see that type of antenna, it's probably a butterfly. Moth antennae, on the other hand, are either feathered or what we call filamentous, which is just thread-like. And then skippers are kind of a weird case here. They actually have hooked antennae. And this is interesting because I almost see this as an intermediate between butterfly and moth antenna, and evolutionarily, skippers are actually an intermediate between butterflies and moths. Again, this is one of the only surefire ways to tell apart butterflies, moths, and skippers. And the reason is because, as I showed on the previous slide, a lot of moths are often mistaken for butterflies because of their bright colors. And on the other hand, there are also some dull butterflies that are sometimes mistaken for moths. Another key trait of Lepidoptera that we are probably all familiar with is that they spend a lot of their life cycle as caterpillars. So we know that that butterflies like the monarch pictured here starts their life as a caterpillar, but moths do the same. So for every adult moth that you see, there is a caterpillar like the woolly bear or tiger moth pictured here. All right, the next question I'm going to address is, why are moths important? Well, I'm going to give you 3 reasons, hopefully to convince you here that moths are important. The first reason is they are extremely diverse. There are around 160,000 moth species described worldwide. This is a phylogenetic tree that's just showing the evolutionary relationships between all the moths. And since there are only about 1.5 to 2 million described total species on Earth, that means that 1 in every 10 described species on Earth is actually a moth. And probably wouldn't guess that because they don't get the attention that they deserve. Looking at the numbers here too, this also means that moths actually represent about 3.5 times more pollinating species than bees and butterflies combined. So out of those 160,000 moth species, about 123,000 of them are known pollinators. And that's compared to only about 17,000 pollinating bee species and 18.5 thousand pollinating butterfly species. And here in Washington State, we have a pretty incredible diversity of moths as well. There are over 1,500 described moth species, and there's actually likely many, many more than this. There are a lot of very tiny little moths that remain undescribed because it's very difficult to identify them. Some of our common local moths here around the Spokane area are the Isabella tiger moth. Macaria adonis here is one of the most common visitors to lights at night. There's a very large species of silk moth, the Ceanothus silk moth. The white-lined sphinx is often seen flying during the day, but also flies at night. This may be one that you're familiar with. These are some of my favorites. I think they have some really cool patterns and colors here. The salt marsh moth, the Rocky Mountain clearwing, which again is often mistaken for a hummingbird. It's also quite large. And then one that is my personal favorite that I have actually seen is the western sheep moth. And those are really the colors that it has. That's not an edited photograph there. So again, as you can see, there's a huge diversity of moths, even right here locally, and they come in a dazzling array of colors and shapes and sizes. So that is my first reason why moths are important. The second reason is they are a major food source for birds, bats, and many other organisms. So as caterpillars, butterflies, and moths are voracious herbivores, they're eating plants, taking in that plant energy. And then as both caterpillars and adults, they are eaten by birds and bats and plenty of other organisms. And it turns out that in these 2 roles as herbivores and then as prey, Lepidoptera transfer more energy from plants to other animals up the food chain than all other herbivores combined. And so really what that means to me is that we need to get okay with herbivory. So, people often cringe at the sight like this of herbivory on plants, especially if they're plants in your garden. But I like to view this site as a sign that you are supporting a functional food web in your local ecosystem. And that's because, again, herbivory fuels food webs. The action of herbivores like butterflies and moths and other insects brings that plant energy from the base of our food web and transfers it up to our consumers like our birds and our bats and other organisms. So this is a really, really important ecosystem function. And those moth caterpillars are feeding a lot of animals out there. Among them are many of our songbirds. Up to 90% of the diet of many of our native songbirds comes from caterpillars, particularly moth caterpillars. And they're especially important for rearing baby birds. You probably are familiar, some of you are probably familiar with the work of Doug Tallamy, who's written a lot about this. And his work has shown that caterpillars are especially palatable to young baby birds. They're soft and squishy, and they also have much more of the nutrients that birds need to develop. So they're super critical for birds. And also, many bats are moth specialists and almost exclusively eat moths. All right, so they're extremely diverse and they're a major food source for birds, bats, and other organisms. The third reason why moths are important is because they are pollinators of both wild and agricultural plant species. And this is what a lot of my own research has focused on. So actually, a recent meta-analysis published last year found that moths and other nocturnal pollinators contribute as much or even more to plant reproduction than diurnal or day-active pollinators like bees. So again, their role as moths has been critically underappreciated. And a lot of the research that has been done on moth pollination has focused on just a few relatively specialized systems. So some of you may be familiar with these night blooming, heavily scented white tubular flowers like datura or evening primrose that are often visited by moths. And those are valid interactions. But the way that I've studied moth pollination is by taking more of a community level and looking at interactions between entire communities of plants and the moths that pollinate them. And I've done this by focusing on what we call plant pollinator interaction networks. So on the bottom, you can see the plant species, and on the top, you can see the moth species, and the lines represent those pollination interactions. So we can study and understand plant pollinator interactions at a community level like this. And I've done a lot of this research in my dissertation at the University of California, Riverside, where I took my little homemade light traps that are literally just a light attached to a bucket, and I went out into a bunch of different ecosystems there in Southern California at night, and I set out these traps, and they collected moths. So here you can see in the deserts all the way up to the mountains on the left side. And there's a lot of really cool moths out there too. This one's about as big as my hand. It's a hawk moth species. Some really cool tiger moths out there as well. And what I did is I looked at the pollen that these moths were carrying on their mouth parts, or their proboscis. And this is a zoomed in view of that, and you can see what looks like little debris on this proboscis, and that's a big coiled proboscis that unfolds like a straw when the mouth feeds. All that little debris are actually individual little pollen grains that it picked up when it was feeding on plant nectar, and it will take that pollen and transfer it to another plant and thereby help those plants reproduce. And some of these proboscides were absolutely clogged full of pollen. I don't even really understand how they're functioning when it looks like that. And in this research, I found that about 60% of all the moths that I caught out there were transporting pollen. And that was about 1,300 individuals from 135 species of moths. And it wasn't just the larger, more colorful moths. It is the boring, dull moths that you probably don't even give a second thought. This proboscis here with all this pollen came from this little, what I consider kind of a boring little gray-brown moth here. I also found that these moths were carrying pollen from 18 different crop species. So that's everything from kiwis to oranges to different kinds of nuts, bananas, you know, you name it, all sorts of different fruits and vegetables that these moths were helping to pollinate. And if you still don't believe me, this is video evidence. A moth in my backyard in Southern California visiting the orange tree that we had there. And I think this is literally the only video I've ever gotten of a moth pollinating. It's pretty hard to catch them in the act at night. So there he goes and flies off to visit another tree. All right, so these are at least 3 reasons why moths are important. So, you know, we want to protect these moths and help them do provide those important functions that they're providing in our ecosystems. But now I'm going to brace you for the bad news, the bad part of this talk, and I'm going to get through this pretty quickly here to the solutions. But the bad news is that moths are declining globally. So we have a lot of evidence for this now over the past 10 years or so. A lot of that evidence is coming from the UK, where they have relatively long-term monitoring projects where they've been monitoring moth diversity and abundance for up to 100 years in some places, and they're showing long-term declines. And we have more recent evidence from parts of the US as well as South America, Central and South America, where they're also showing pretty drastic moth declines recently. And it's not just moths. In fact, we are in the midst of what some authors are calling the insect apocalypse right now. You may have seen the headlines in some of these popular newspapers. And this isn't just inflammatory news headlines. The data is showing us that insect abundance is declining by about 1 to 2% per year globally. So every year there are about 2% fewer butterflies, fewer moths, fewer insects out there. This was from a recent paper in just this found a 22% decline in the total number of butterflies between the year 2000 and the year 2020. And this was in the Western US, I believe. And in fact, more than 1 in 5 pollinator species are at risk, at elevated risk of extinction right now. And that extinction risk is clustered in the Western United States, especially the Southwest, where insects are facing compounded threats from climate change and habitat loss. And, you know, there are a lot of different reasons why insects are declining, why birds are declining, why a bunch of different organisms are declining right now. And for insects, this has been described using the phrase death by 1,000 cuts. And this is basically the idea that insects are just having so many threats thrown at them from all different sides that it's often hard to pinpoint what the predominant cause behind any decline in any single species is. And more often than not, it's probably a combination of many different stressors. And that includes everything from habitat loss, including mostly from agriculture, pollution, including light pollution, which is particularly bad for moths. We have pesticide use, especially in agriculture. And of course, we have the myriad effects of climate change, which is wreaking havoc not just on insects, but on species worldwide, including humans. One thing I find pretty interesting, this was a recent paper that found that the relative importance of these threats in terms of how strong they're driving declines varies geographically. So this is a figure that's showing that in the Western US, it's actually mostly climate change that is threatening insects. But in the Midwest and in parts of the East Coast, it switches more over to agriculture and some of these other threats like housing and urban development and pollution. Here in Washington, it's kind of an even mix between climate change and agriculture that's driving insect declines. So that's the bad news. But the good news is there is hope. I know that seeing these headlines and hearing this news can make us feel hopeless, but there really are things that we can do, and those things really can make a difference. So I'm going to spend the rest of this talk going through some of these things that everyone can do to help. And part of the good news here is that insects have very fast generation times. And what that means is if we provide them the right conditions, they can actually recover relatively quickly, especially compared to other species like especially large mammals and relatively longer lived organisms.
I'm going to talk again at 7, but it's already going out.
All right. So another part of this story is that we're seeing more and more evidence that even urban areas and city centers even can support insects when we design them appropriately and provide insects the right conditions in those areas. And that's partly because even though these areas may not be large nature reserves and may not be a pristine habitat, that's not the only thing that insects need in our changing world. We need these stepping stone patches between our larger natural areas, and urban areas, suburban areas, even agricultural areas can serve as these critical stepping stone patches that help species respond and adapt to threats like climate change. And so we need to start rethinking our urban and suburban areas. I live on the South Hill, so this is around where I live. Into these landscapes that can provide these types of stepping stones between our larger protected areas that allow insects to move and adapt and get resources from these areas. So I'm going to go through 5 things you can do to help provide those right conditions for insects and help protect moths and other pollinators. And the first and most important one is to plant native plants. So one of the main reasons that insects are declining right now is because they're losing the resources that they need to thrive. And one of the reasons behind that is that a lot of our urban and suburban landscapes look something like this. And the reason that lawns are so bad for insects and other biodiversity is because a lot of insects are what we call host plant specialists. And this means that they can often rely on just one or a few native plant species. And the most famous example of this is the monarch butterfly pictured here. Famously a host plant specialist where its caterpillars can only develop on milkweed species. But it's not just the monarch. In fact, about 90% of all plant-eating insects are host plant specialists, meaning that overwhelmingly they're only able to rely on just one or a few native plant lineages that they've co-evolved with. And so that underscores why native plants are so important for insects. Some research has shown that native plants can support up to 15 times more native butterfly and moth species than introduced and ornamental plants. Native plants also come with other benefits, including reduced water consumption and reduced maintenance once they're established. And really, to see those biodiversity benefits, it's best to aim for, is this still on? Feels like, okay. It's best to aim for about 70% native plant cover. So again, this doesn't mean that we only have to plant native plants. We can plant some of those ornamentals that you may like, but really to support insects in the best way possible, it's best to have at least 70% native plant cover. Another thing to keep in mind about butterflies and moths is that they need both native host plants and nectar plants. So host plants are those that are eaten by the caterpillars, and nectar plants are those that are visited and often pollinated by the adult butterflies and moths. And these aren't always the same. So oftentimes butterflies and moths will utilize different host plants than the ones that they then visit for nectar. So one of the issues is it can be very difficult to determine what are the good host plants and nectar plants for the butterflies and moths in my area. And so this is something that my research group and I have been tackling over the last few years. So in a big collaboration with a bunch of groups in California, the California Native Plant Society, National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, we've been compiling a bunch of plant-insect interaction data and analyzing these interaction networks. So we can see which insects are visiting which plants for host plants, for nectar plants. And by analyzing these networks, we can identify what we call keystone plant species. And those are often the plants that are supporting the greatest number of insect species in the community. And we plugged this data in California into a new tool through the California Native Plant Society, the Calscape Pollinator Companion. And so this is an interactive tool that allows you to put in your location and indicate your planting priorities, which types of pollinators you want to support, and other things like that. And then at the end of that process, it'll give you a list of the best native plants for butterflies, moths, and other pollinators in your local ecoregion. And so I really hope to bring this type of research and these types of tools to other parts of the country. I'm currently working on some research in Washington to bring this to Washington, and we're seeking funding right now to expand this type of plant selection resource across the country. So a few other things I'll note about native gardening. One thing, a common pitfall is these wildflower mixes that you often see at the big box stores like Home Depot. These often not only don't contain locally native species, but many times they actually contain invasive species that do not even belong on our continent and are harmful for local ecosystems and biodiversity. So be very wary of these. Some of them are better than others, but the best thing to do is look for local nurseries and seed sellers that sell plants that are locally native, or what we call indigenous to your local region. And some great resources to help you do this are the Washington Native Plant Society, the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and the Pollinator Partnership also both have eco-regional planting guides that will tell you what are the native plants to your ecoregion, the area that you live, that also support pollinators. And then one last thing I'll mention, because I'm really excited about this, I don't own a house, so I was not able to do this personally, but if I did own a house, I would definitely get on this. This is Spokanescape, so it's a program through the local city government that allows you to replace your lawn, or they help you replace your lawn with native plants. And in return, you can get a $500 credit towards your utility bill. And personally, I've seen a lot of these yard transitions across Spokane, and I always think that they look a lot better after. And again, you're supporting local insects as well as birds and other wildlife by doing this, and saving on your water bill. So I want to mention some policy progress when it comes to native gardening or native pollinator habitat. This is Washington State Pollinator Habitat Protection Bill that was signed in 2024, SB 5934. And this allows cities and counties in Washington to encourage building permit applicants to include pollinator plants in landscaping. And it also prohibits cities, counties, and HOAs from banning pollinator habitat and native lawns. And that's huge because it turns out that HOAs are actually a major impediment to gardening for biodiversity, often because it's perceived as messy, which is not always the case, as we can see in the Spokanescape program. It can look beautiful and neat and tidy, but I think we need to start getting away from those prohibitive policies and towards more biodiversity friendly policies. All right. The second thing I'll introduce to help protect moths and other pollinators is limiting intense maintenance. So this includes mowing less often, leave the leaves, which is kind of a national program or catchphrase at least that caught on recently, leaving some standing dead plants. And this is because insects actually need dead plant matter for a lot of different reasons. When it comes to moths, they actually overwinter. Many species overwinter under leaf litter. And so even if you can just leave one pile of dead leaves in the fall, which right now would be a great time to do that, that can really help those insects survive through the winter. And then a lot of other organisms, a lot of other insects like bees need hollow dead stems to nest in, to lay their larvae in. So leaving some of that standing dead plant material, even if it's just in one small patch, can go a long way for insects. Third thing is going chemical free. So reducing the use of harmful pesticides, which are one of the leading drivers of insect decline right now, especially some really harmful classes of pesticides that I'll talk about in a second now. But one thing we can do as an alternative to using pesticides is to try to attract beneficial insects, and native plant gardening is how we do this. So as an example of this, I'm going to go through a scenario. Let's say I have a vegetable garden in my backyard, and I have been using pesticides because aphids are attacking my tomatoes. Those bastards. Now there are a lot of other insects that actually love to eat aphids, including this little guy here, which is a hoverfly larva. And so this turns into the stage that you're probably more familiar with, the hoverfly, which also kind of looks like a bee. And it turns out that these hoverflies also pollinate native plants, and they may also pollinate our crops, including our tomatoes. So one of the ways that we can support these beneficial insects that help control pests is actually by planting the native plants that support the adult life stages. So back to the policy progress here in Washington State, we last year also passed a neonicotinoid restriction. So neonics are one of the worst classes of pesticides, super harmful to insects. There are also tons of negative consequences for all different sorts of organisms, including humans. They've been linked to birth defects and cancer and all sorts of other stuff. So they're bad news. A lot of different parts of the world have been completely banning these. Perhaps not surprisingly, the US is lagging on that. But at least we have some state level policies here, including this one, which in Washington prohibits most outdoor non-agricultural uses. So that's most residential uses of neonics beginning in January of next year. And this was specifically to protect pollinators from harmful exposure. All right, the fourth thing that you can do to help protect moths and other pollinators is reduce unnecessary light pollution. So light pollution is one of the leading causes of decline behind moths and probably a lot of other organisms, although there's a lot of research to be done there. When you see moths flying around lights at night, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, that means that they're being attracted to those lights. So that's literally how I study moths, is by attracting them with light traps. But they are traps. They are being trapped at these lights. So you may even see them the next day on the walls and other surfaces near those lights. So what this is really doing is those moths are attracted to the light. They stay there flying around or staying on the surfaces around those lights at night. When the daytime comes, moths like to stay still to avoid being seen by predators. And so they'll often just stay there in the same place that they were caught that night. And then the next night comes around and the cycle repeats itself. So this is a horrible feedback loop here that is literally trapping these moths here. Many of them die because they get exhausted, or this also exposes them to predators like spiders and bats. Or they simply die because they're just there doing nothing. And that also means that they're not out there feeding and pollinating plants and not out there reproducing to ensure future generations. So this is really bad news for moths. But light pollution is not just bad for moths. It's bad for all sorts of other wildlife, including birds. It disturbs their migration patterns. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with, there's been in past years a national effort to try to get the word out there for people to turn their lights off during bird migration season. But it's also bad for humans. I mean, light pollution has been linked to everything from obesity to diabetes to breast cancer. And that's one of the reasons why your doctor may tell you to stay off your phone, especially at night. So, reducing light pollution is good for everyone. And there's 5 things that you can do. This is through the International Dark Sky Association. 5 things that you can do or five lighting principles for responsible outdoor lighting. number one, make sure it's useful, so don't have lights where you don't need them. Two, make sure they're targeted, so you can put them on, you can use shields to make sure that they're shielded downwards and not glowing out into the sky around. That's actually been shown to be one of the best things to reduce the impact on moths and other wildlife. You can make sure that they are low level, so just make sure that they're no brighter than they need to be for their intended purpose. You can make sure that they are controlled. This means putting them on timers or motion sensors to reduce the amount of time that they're on. And finally, if you can make sure that they're warm colored. So when you see kind of like white fluorescent LED lights, that's actually the type of lighting that is the worst for moths and birds and other organisms. So what we think of as more like a softer incandescent glow is actually better when it comes to its effect on wildlife. And there are actually increasingly LEDs that are both energy efficient and reduce the impact on wildlife. So they have those softer glows. So if you can look into getting those, actually, they sell them pretty much everywhere now. I personally think they look a lot nicer too. All right, and some policy progress on light pollution. Well, the fact is there's not a lot of progress here. So this is, in my opinion, one of the areas that we need the most policy effort on. In the US, most outdoor lighting policy is issued primarily at the municipal level. And so, for example, in Spokane here, the municipal code requires outdoor lights to be shielded downward and confined to property boundaries to prevent glare and trespass. Personally, looking around, I don't think that most people even follow these guidelines, even though they're technically laws. But this just goes to show you there's literally no other requirements for lighting. They don't need to be on motion sensors. They don't need to be on timers. There's no restrictions on the color temperature. And there's absolutely no considerations for their ecological impacts on pollinators, birds, or other wildlife. So there's a lot of work that we need to do when it comes to light pollution. It's one of the most critically under appreciated threats to wildlife, I think. Yep.
Or schools adhere to a lot of these programs, just like our elementary schools, high schools, colleges.
That's a great question. So, yeah, I'll repeat the question. So the question was, do the elementary schools or other municipal areas or schools actually comply with these regulations? I honestly don't know. I mean, again, like looking around, I see violations of even these simple like shield rules and confined to property boundary. Like technically, you're not supposed to be seeing a big impact on light outside of its property, which is simply like not the case. So the problem is a lot of these things are not enforced, and it's because like part of it is because there's not as much of an appreciation for how bad this is for wildlife and even for us as humans. So I think that the more that we get the word out there for how bad this is, the more that those things will catch on and the more it will probably be enforced. It,
Okay. Oh,
wait. We're almost there to questions. So, all right. So the last thing that we can do to help protect moths and other pollinators is contribute to community science. So community science is, well, you all are bird people, so I'm sure you know eBird, but there are other great community science platforms that help anyone everywhere, anytime, contribute observations of insects, plants, birds, you name it, to these platforms where they can actually go and contribute to science and conservation. And I will tell you with confidence that the data that you upload to iNaturalist to eBird is being used in professional conservation efforts. And I know that because I use it almost every day in my own projects. All right, so wrapping this talk up, I hope that I gave you a little bit more of appreciation for moths and their importance in our ecosystems as pollinators, as food for other wildlife, and some of the things that we can do to help protect them. Because although we don't see a lot of attention on moths compared to bees, I hope that soon we will see as much momentum to save the moths as we do to save the bees. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming here and listening to my talk. If you have questions that we can't get to today, my email is on the screen, so you can go ahead and email me. And while I take questions, I'm going to leave this here because the fact is that science is under attack right now in this country, and there are a lot of things that everyone can do to help with that as well. And these are some of those things. Thank you.
My other question was about, I spend some of my time in Arizona in the wintertime, and there's an township called Fountain Hills, and they are a dark city, and they get incentives through their I guess for the utilities and all that, they get a lot of incentives to be a dark city to help with nature, the whole ecosystem, because it all, like you said, everything benefits from being dark, from all the critters. And I was wondering if we have ever, like a Vista or anybody has ever tried to encourage communities. I live in a neighborhood, a cul-de-sac with townhouses, and I was thinking it would be really cool to become a dark neighborhood. And I don't know if people know about doing that and how healthy it is for our environment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have like a great answer for you because I think it just varies from one place to another. But I will say that I think in like the example that you mentioned, that town that became dark sky certified, that's happening more and more across the country. And a lot of places actually started because of astronomy observing. So astronomers started getting pissed that they couldn't see the stars anymore. This actually dark sky, I think in the US was pioneered in Flagstaff, Arizona, which is a big astronomy city. And so, yeah, this is happening across the country. And I think it usually starts with grassroots efforts. It's usually starting with people making noise about it and, doing some of the things that you can do here, contacting local representatives. That's super, super powerful. And I think that's one of the great ways that we as citizens can make change in our local communities.
Other questions?
Could you comment on the negative effects that some moth species are having in the timberlands in this area?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, moths are often vilified, and that's one of the reasons. There are some species that are very destructive forest pests that often defoliate entire trees and lead to mass forest dieback. So oftentimes those cyclical outbreak type species, those outbreaks are precipitated by other things like land use change, climate change. So a lot of things that we are doing are making those outbreaks much, much worse. But I will also say that these ecosystems, these forests, are adapted to these types of outbreaks in one way or another. So these insects have been undergoing these cyclical outbreaks for hundreds of thousands of years. And so in their natural state, they can handle them. But again, the more that we cut down those forests, the more that we increase the spread of invasive pests and climate change, the more climate change causes insects to spread into areas where they were not once. We're seeing more and more destructive impacts of those types of pest species. And so, yeah, I think that it's all another symptom of all of these interrelated threats that are causing declines in some species, but unfortunately also outbreaks in others that are often the pest species.
Couple of questions actually. One, so if moths are nighttime pollinators, are they pollinating things that daytime pollinators don't? And anyway, and then the other question was, with your work in California, is California way ahead of a lot of other states on some of these policy issues?
Yeah, so first question, are moths pollinating different plants than daytime pollinators? The answer is we don't really know yet. And it's actually, I have a research project right now with some collaborators in Montana where we're exploring just that question. We're looking at plant pollinator interaction networks involving both daytime pollinators and moths, and sort of looking at the overlap between which species are pollinating which plants. And we're finding basically that moths are pretty generalist pollinators. So they're going to be visiting pretty much everything out there, including subsets of plants that bees and daytime pollinators do not visit. And those are often those tubular, nocturnally blooming, white, heavily scented flowers like datura. So it depends on the species, but they are also going to be visiting like asters and plants that we commonly associate with daytime pollinators as well. Oh yeah, and then the California question, is California ahead? California is ahead on a lot of things when it comes to the environment. Washington isn't too bad. Some states are horrible. But California has a lot of resources when it comes to native plant gardening. The California Native Plant Society has done a lot more work in California than I've seen other societies do in other states. And that's partly because California funds environmental work a lot more than other parts of the country do. So I think my simple answer is yes, they are ahead. And that is reflected both in the types of organizations that we have doing this type of work and also in some of the policies as well.
Do we have a Spokane Native Plant Society?
Spokane Native Plant Society, I am not sure. Does anyone know that?
I don't understand why our libraries, our schools don't have native plant gardens. We don't have, I don't think there's native plants out here.
Yeah, there is.
There is? Okay. Oh, they do? Okay, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, any small amount helps. Like I have seen in the news recently I think it may have been a library that I read about that installed a native pollinator garden. But yeah, I think schools, libraries, places that kids are, because kids like this stuff, especially, those are great candidates to be installing pollinator habitat.
Mhm. Can I get an explanation from you, Chris, on the truth, if there is truth to the moths being attracted upside down to outdoor lighting because they think it's the sun or the moon? Or...
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Am I still on here? Yeah. Yeah. So I think it was last year a paper came out that basically claimed to finally solve the thousands-year-old mystery of why moths are attracted to lights, because we didn't really know. There's been a lot of theories. One of the theories was that moths use the moon and the stars to help navigate. But this paper, if I'm remembering correctly, basically showed that the relative light of sky, even if the moon's not there, even if the stars aren't out as much, is greater than the light coming from the earth. So the moths basically know like which way is up and which way is down, and they do use that to navigate. And so when you put lights on, artificial lights out, you're creating a strong point source of light that is basically throwing balance completely off, and they don't really know what's up and what's down. And actually what they end up doing is trying to keep that light on one side of their body the whole
Oh, yeah.
time, spiraling and spiraling and spiraling towards. That's why you see the spiraling behavior. So that's the current best theory. I think this paper did a good job pretty much, quote unquote, proving that, but there's probably other parts to the mystery that we'll find out.
Sweet. Thank you.
Okay, this ban on nicotides that's coming up the 1st of 2026.
Yeah.
Does that mean actually they won't be sold at Ace and these places? Or is it just up to people that we can still, but we just aren't supposed to use them, but they can sell it. Do you
Yeah,
know?
so I don't know exactly how they're gonna roll this out. So yes, January 2026 is the date that that policy is supposed to take effect. And there's a couple of caveats here. The first thing is that it doesn't apply to everything. So it doesn't apply to all uses of pesticides. Importantly, any agricultural use is exempt to that, and that's a problem because most of the pesticides we're using is agricultural pesticides. But it does apply to most like what I would call like casual residential uses. So that includes like, people spraying like raid or whatever it is at a bee's nest or stuff like that. So I think they are going to start regulating what types of products are sold. I mean, the only way I think it would make sense is to stop selling those locally. I don't know if that's actually how it's going to work because corporations always seem to finagle their way into these and mess it up, but we'll see.
How attached are you to the word moth? I'm wondering if we can rebrand. No, because those really pretty ones, like that, I mean, I never knew moths could be like that. Do you think there's any flexibility with that? If that could be helpful in a
Well,
campaign?
I mean, I think in Spanish they literally call them like night butterflies or something like that. So we could rebrand to that. I've called them the bees of the night before. Like, I think it's a great idea. If you have an idea, then let me know.
I just wanted to add that WSU has a really nice research garden here in Spokane. And they look at a bunch of different native plants and they're putting out research about plants and how they work together in an ecosystem and all that. So they do tours of the garden, which is really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah,
It's through WSU Extension. I can't remember exactly where it's located though, but it's
cool. There is also one at Gonzaga too, a demonstration garden. My fiance is a researcher at Gonzaga, and they do some pollination work there too.
222 Havana, the WSU extension, and they're putting in a Palouse prairie. They're ripping out all the grass at the WSU extension, and they've been given the permission and the funds to put in a Palouse prairie.
Awesome.
When we leave tonight, the door in the library is closed, but we have to leave through this door. But if you need to use the restroom, take a right and another right, and